So at least one person knows what we're talking about this morning. It's Adam. He prayed about our Galatians study. And actually a couple of things. He mentioned us making an application. Sometimes I think I fail to always make that connection. So as we go through the study, if I miss something or if you want to point out an application that I'm not making, that'd be great to help me out in that. So this is the first time I've taught a class from start to finish. So I've been reading the book a lot for the last few months. I've kind of had a hard time figuring out exactly how I wanted to start and to begin the whole discussion. And one of the things I finally came to the conclusion of is a lot of us have studied the book before and been through a class on the book before. And so it's not going to be new to all of us, maybe some people, but so, we're not going to be discussing necessarily a lot of new things. And so one of the things I figured out was we need to just kind of review or do an overview of the book to kind of get a framework of what Paul's talking about. Because really, when we study the Bible, it's not like when we read like a mystery novel or something. We don't want to figure out what's going on at the end until the end. It's good if we know what's going on big picture as we read through something. And we see, really, we kind of, from the very first verse of Galatians, it's good to know the big picture of what he's even talking about. So I figured maybe what we could do is we'll go through the book today, and being inexperienced, I don't know if I've got enough material to make the whole class, like I was telling Mike a while ago, or if we're going to have like way too much and I'll not be able to get done. So we'll figure it out when we get there, I guess. And if we finish early, but maybe we'll go into the first few verses. But so I figure we'll look through the book, and we're going to look for information or try to remember information about the people, the places. There's some mention of time frame in the book, and then we'll get into some of the subject. We'll kind of get an overview of the subject matter. So let's start out with the people. Let's see. So largely, the first two chapters are kind of autobiographical. I think that's the right term in nature, because Paul is retelling the story of his conversion, the story of his preaching with the Galatians. And so there's a lot of information on him alone just in the first two chapters, and even later on in the book. And so I figure we start with him. So right from the very beginning, what are some things as you look at Galatians chapter 1, the first few verses even, that we learn about Paul? And the questions are not hard. So don't be embarrassed to answer a very easy question. Just thank you. I got a brave person there. Thank you, Brett. Yeah, apostle, what he kind of qualifies that a little bit. He's an apostle, but what?
Not from man, but from Jesus.
Exactly. And so he's not from man, but from Jesus, and additionally God the Father. So he's kind of throwing down here from the very beginning who he is, and is establishing what?
Authority.
Yeah, authority. And so the very first thing we see is that he's an apostle. He has the authority. Now, later on, let's see in the next few verses. My problem is the Bible I was studying with at home was on my desk, and the pages are different. And so where I was looking, so I'm gonna have to study with this Bible to bring the different one to church. But he also was trying to establish something about his gospel that he preached. Maybe around verses, let's see, what verses are those? Anybody see where he's establishing something about his gospel? Similar to his apostleship. Okay, what do you got there?
I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel preached by me is not based on a human point of view.
Okay. Some others may say a little bit different, but it's not according to man. But okay, so he says his message is not from man, but then he kind of goes on a little later and says that he got it from God, or from Jesus, from Revelation. And again, I think he's trying to establish Not just authority for himself, but authority for his message that he's taught the Galatians. Any thoughts on those two things? And I don't want to give away too much because we're going to study it, here. But any other thoughts on how he begins his book there, or the letter? Okay, so we also see around verse 13, he talks about his former life in Judaism. And based on this, what we read here and other things, what are some of the things we know about Paul from his former life around verse 13? That's exactly right. He persecuted God's church, and also there's two things that he says there after that. He says beyond measure, and he tried to destroy it. So Paul was very diligent at what he was trying to do, wasn't he? And he tells them that they knew of his former manner of life. In verse 14, I think we also see another thing about him. He was a rising star in Judaism, so to speak. It says he was advancing in Judaism beyond many of his contemporaries. Okay. So he gives them a little bit of, I guess it's more of a reminder of his background that they know about. Verse 15 through the end of the chapter, he talks about what he did after his conversion. What does he say around verses 17 or 18 about after his conversion? What did he do?
He didn't go to Jerusalem, he went off by himself.
Yeah, he didn't go to Jerusalem. And, maybe one of the first thoughts is what would he have done? He had been there persecuting people, and he left to go persecute people. He became a Christian. What do you think naturally some of us would have done? Maybe gone back to Jerusalem to maybe right some of the wrongs. But we see here that Paul, he said he makes it a point to say he didn't go to Jerusalem. And actually he makes it a point to say he didn't go there to the apostles. But he went to Arabia, then returned to Damascus. All right, anything else? Which I think there's something that some stuff he says here that's kind of interesting. Let's see. He says, I went to Syria and Cilicia, still unknown to many of the churches in Judea that were in Christ, but they kept hearing and they were glorifying God. But he makes it a point to say that in those early days or years of being a Christian / apostle, he points out his lack of interaction with the other apostles, which I kind of find interesting. And so I feel like there's some significance to these details. It's not like he's just telling us. So as we study the book, we'll see there's some significance, I believe, to him not having the interaction with the apostles. And I feel like that's why he points that out. All right, so in chapter 2, we see, we learn a little bit more about Paul and some of his characteristics, I guess, by what he mentions about interacting with two different people. The first one would be one of his traveling companions, that'd be Titus. What did we know about Titus? There around verses 2 and 3, I guess 3, when Paul goes to Jerusalem. Who was Titus?
Greek crowds.
He was a Greek. And so what do you kind of imply about the Greeks when it comes to circumcision? He was uncircumcised. So when Paul says he takes him to Jerusalem, he says that he refused to have Titus circumcised. And let's see, where was that verse that really, I think he said that he didn't yield for a moment. So we see that he's very firm in his conviction and belief on this whole idea of circumcision. And then another, he's very convicted. Yeah, verse 5, he didn't yield. And then also there's another interaction he has with somebody there in chapter 2 that kind of shows some of his conviction. Does anybody see that? It's around verse maybe 11 and 12. Who did he interact with in verse 11? Yeah, Peter, thank you. See, the obvious answers are always easy. Appreciate that. Yeah, so with Peter, and why does he oppose Peter to his face? Because he had been he changed his behavior when certain men came from Jerusalem, and he was eating with the Gentiles and then not eating with the Gentiles after they came. But what we see about Paul again in this is that he opposed Peter to his face very much like he didn't yield to the other men earlier. And so we see about his conviction and, about his character. So as we move on into chapter 4, with specifically with Paul and some of his, what we can learn about him, we learn about his relationship with the Gentiles. And he reminds them in, let's see, of how he even came to preach the gospel with them to begin with. What does it say there? How he became to preach the gospel? I think it's around 12 and 13. It says he became there because of bodily illness that he preached the gospel for the first time. So it makes you wonder a few things. I mean, had he planned to go somewhere else and he just kind of had to end up there? But just I find that's interesting that he, was because of bodily ailment or bodily illness. And how did that affect them? This is also an interesting thing. In verse 14, his condition affected them how? It was a trial to them. Do y'all see that? So his illness was somehow a trial to them. And how did they respond to that? Did they cave to the trial or the pressure? Verse 14, I think. They received him as an angel of God. So they were very receptive to that. And also, it says in verse 15, which is another one of those statements that makes you kind of wonder exactly what was going on. It says that they would have given their eyes for him. So you may wonder if this bodily condition could have been something to do with, his eyes or his vision. So we see in chapters 1 and 2, his early life as a Christian. Chapter 4, some of the interaction with the Galatian people. Now let's move on to the Galatians themselves. From the very early parts of the book, the letter, what is something we learn about the Galatians around verse 6? This kind of starts to reveal, the problem.
They're turning to a different gospel.
They're turning to a different gospel. They're deserting him who called them. Did you see that? So they're deserting God, turning to a different gospel. And this leads to some amazement on Paul's part. And I think we can kind of understand the amazement part of that by when we look at chapter 3, what he says to them. There's 3 things there, I think, in chapter 3 that he kind of reminds them. He tells them there in verse 1, he says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus was publicly portrayed as crucified? He says, you're being led away, even though first of all, you've had Christ crucified preached to you publicly, openly, and completely, I guess you could say. And then another point that he makes to them is he asks them a question, really, and implies something. Look at verse 2. What question does he ask them? He says, I want to find out, did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by the hearing with faith? He doesn't say, did you receive the Spirit? He says, did you receive it by which thing? So that implies immediately to me that they had received the Spirit. Does everybody see that? So again, he asked this question to try to, show it kind of proves his amazement. And then also in verse 4, what else had happened to him that he kind of thinks that creates some of this amazement that he says there from that first chapter. They suffered. He said, did you suffer so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? So he says, I'm amazed that you've you're turning away from the gospel. Even though Christ was preached to you, the full history of Christ and what he'd done, death, burial, resurrection, even though you received the Spirit, and then you've suffered these things. And so those three things, I think, really we'll see that they lead to his amazement. Any thoughts on any of that? Yes, sir.
First century spirit, people were speaking in tongues and prophesying and whatever, or is what degree is the spirit active in their lives? I guess is what I'm asking, because it seems to me that if you get people prophesying and speaking in tongues and healing people and all special spiritual gifts, that it would have been much more consequential if they had turned their back on it.
So one of the benefits of this being the first class is I get to say, we'll talk about that later. The answer to your question immediately, I don't know 100%, but hopefully as we get to there, we'll talk more about that. Is that acceptable for right now? Now, if it was the last class, I might not get away with that, but yeah, so we'll talk more about that. And I understand, I think your point that, if it was this bigger having the Spirit like it was prevalent at that time, that it would be harder to ignore. Is that basically kind of like what you're asking? So, hopefully we'll discuss that as we get there. Any other thoughts?
Well, what Paul's point in that section, he gives them three things that demonstrate they would believe the gospel and would follow the gospel. And now the gospel is that Jesus Christ is their only hope of salvation. And now they were wavering on that because somebody come in and were teaching them something else.
Okay.
And that's a different gospel. They're wavering on the idea that Jesus is our source of salvation.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that as we get into really the problem that's going on there. Let's see.
Mike, did we read verse 5?
Probably not yet. Well, which chapter? Because we've been in all the chapters on this. No, we didn't yet. I hadn't really put that down for today. Can we talk about that a little later?
Yeah, but I was thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not really prepared, I guess, to talk about that right now at the moment. So moving on with just our understanding about the Galatians, would you say the Galatians were mostly Jews or mostly Gentiles? Based on if you read the book or studied the book. I would agree with that. And I would look at just chapter 4, verse 8. However, at that time when you did not know God, you were slaves to those that were by nature no gods. I think that might be a little bit of I'm not going to say a stretch, but I think that we could assume that most of them, based on that, were probably Gentile descent. And so I think that knowing that they were mostly Gentiles will be helpful to us as we go through the study. Also, chapter 4, verse 19. How does Paul refer to them, the Galatian people? Yeah, as his children. And we see that language in some of the other epistles. What do we kind of generally think understand that means? He had a close relationship, as you know, as a father would with children, because he had taught them the gospel, was bringing them along in their faith, and they had a relationship with him. And so I think that we see his genuine care and concern for them. So that's just some of the things that, you know, we see about the Galatians. There's other individuals, specific people named in the book. We'll see that Peter, Barnabas, as I mentioned earlier, Titus, James, the Lord's brother. He mentions Abraham from a long time ago.
Actually, I could, Abraham, section, chapter 4, 21, that some of these people apparently were interested in the law and stuff. I don't know if that means that some of them were Jews or some of them were just learning about that whole system from a few Jews and following that path or something. But I agree with you. I think the majority were Greeks, but some of them may have been curious Greeks like this.
I would agree that there are Jews in these churches. Eddie.
Just to add on to what David was saying, it's very clear, especially from chapter 3, that they were very familiar with the law. They understood it intimately. It was a temptation for them to use law as the basis of their relationship with Christ. And so, you know, I would agree that probably the primary part of the church was Gentile. But even those that were Gentile were very familiar with the law of Moses. And they're very familiar with what it taught. And the challenge was understanding the lessons that you learned from there, but realize that going back to that law as the basis of your relationship with Christ is not the answer.
So I would probably maybe think that the reason they do know a lot about the law is because about the group of people that we're going to talk about in a few minutes and the influence that they had on the group, because what they believed and kind of where they stood. Does that make sense? So let's speak of it. Let's move on to this other group of people, and they're never really mentioned by name in the book. Maybe one place they kind of are given a label, and we'll see that in just a second. But this other group of people, they're causing problems. They're the group that in these churches that are misleading the Christians. And so in chapter 1, I guess in verse 7, we kind of talked a little bit about it already, but what is it that they're doing? We see they're doing two things, this group of people. They disturbing the people and distorting the gospel. So whatever they're saying is creating this maybe turmoil, a disruption in what's going on. And then they're distorting the gospel. And that kind of leads us back to understanding why Paul makes the point earlier about his gospel and where he got it from. Now I'll ask you this. Do you think that these people that are doing this are Christians? That it may be a little bit of a hard question. In chapter 2, verse 4, he refers to them as false brethren, I think is where it was. Yeah, false brethren secretly brought in. So are these brethren in the sense of brothers in Christ? Or are they non-Christians, that are brought in? So maybe we can see that. And I would tend to think that they're Christians. People that have become Christians. And as we're going to see, they're holding on to the law pretty firmly. And in chapter 2, verse 12 is, like I said a second ago, it's for the only time I really see that they're even given a name and how are they labeled there? Chapter 2, verse 12. The party of what? The party of a party of circumcision. And that should kind of like make us immediately think to law, because circumcision was a heavy part of the law. Let's see. So we'll see, there's a few things that Paul says about them and really kind of what drives them, what motivates them through chapters 4, 5, and 6. Just to point out chapter 4, specifically verse 17. What does he say there in verse 17? They're and so it says eager to win their favor. So the false teachers are eager to win the Galatians' favor. My version, New American Standard, says they eagerly seek you, and then it adds not commendably. So they're eagerly seeking them, and not really in an honorable way. It's not for benefit. It's for the Galatians. But it's for the benefit of these troublemakers that are there. And it also says they want to shut the Galatians out so that the Galatians will make much of them. That kind of reminds me of like middle school dynamics. And I limit it to middle school, but maybe it's the same way as adults. You have people that are trying really to manipulate other people for the benefit of their own benefit. And we'll kind of see that as we study through the book. Also in chapter 6, verse 12 through 13, what does he say about them here? Those who desire to make a good showing in the flesh try to compel you to be circumcised, simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. For those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves, but they desire to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh. This kind of speaks to some of that motivation that we were talking about there a second ago, how they were eagerly seeking them in a dishonorable way. They're trying to get the Galatians to be circumcised just so it makes them look good, and it keeps them from what? Being what? Persecuted. Yes, sir.
We see this one thing in Acts 15, that there were Jewish Christians based in Jerusalem that would travel doing what we would call missionary work. And some of them, in their missionary work, were going around trying to convince the Gentile Christians to be circumcised. And you can understand, since they're coming from Jerusalem, that if they can report to the Jewish community, hey, all these people that have, come to Christ, we've been convincing them to be circumcised, that would relieve some of the pressure that the church in Jerusalem was facing from the Jews themselves. And I think this verse puts that right into context to understand. They're doing that essentially because of the trouble they're facing at home. So if they can go and say, we're teaching them to be circumcised, that relieves the persecution they're facing in Jerusalem.
Okay. And then when it comes to persecution, you also think about what Paul says earlier in the book, almost the exact opposite, because he makes the point. He says, if I'm not preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted, or something like that? And so it's kind of like the opposite of that point that you're making there. So, okay. Any other thoughts on that? So another thing he points out there is that these people, they're not even keeping the law. Chapter 6, verse 13. For those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves, and they desire to have them circumcised so they can boast. So does that remind you of any group of people that would really hold fast to the law and then really maybe not do it all themselves or anything?
All the Jewish leaders that Jesus interacted with.
Yeah, exactly. And I was thinking Pharisees specifically, but yeah, really all those people, the Pharisees, Sadducees, everybody that Jesus interacted with is very similar. They all kind of would fall into that category. So that makes you wonder if some of these people, these Pharisees or whoever, they had become Christians and were still, as Eddie suggested, we're trying to force the law on Christians at this time. So that just gives us a rough idea of, some of the people, Paul, the Galatians, what's going on with the people in the book. Even though it's 6 chapters, there's a whole lot of info there about Paul and the Galatians and the other people. Let's see here.
Just, well, I think when we see this conflict, it's either Paul had been preaching salvation is through faith in Jesus Christ. Now they come saying, well, we've got to add circumcision to that. You undermine Jesus Christ. When you do that, they were teaching salvation for God's people are those who are circumcised. You can be in Christ, but you got to be circumcised. That completely undermines the gospel and undermines Jesus Christ. That seems to be the conflict that we do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you brought that up. I was about to shift into subject matter is some of the why this is being written. So I just wrote down, given that the Galatians are predominantly Gentiles, they've become Christians, what are these people that are causing all the trouble? What is it that they're trying to do ultimately? Get followers, but they're trying to force the law of Moses on the Gentiles, on the Galatians, these new converts. And I think, we see that prime example of that, chapter 2, verse 14, again, back when he's talking about Peter. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all, if you being a Jew live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? So these people, this influence is trying to force these Gentile converts to live like Jews. I think it's kind of important at this point to point out just things that we already know. The Jews, historically, all the way through the Old Testament, they're the descendants of Abraham. And they looked to Abraham. That was like their claim to fame, in a way. So they're descendants of Abraham, which means they're God's chosen people. They're recipients of the promises. And by and large, the promises are fulfilled through them. Right? So those 3 things, they've been given the law. They have this special relationship with God. They have a covenant relationship with God. And so they're separate from all the rest of the world, all the rest of the peoples of the world. And it was in large part due to this covenant relationship, if not completely due to that, the covenant relationship that they had with God. And so they realized that, they understood that. And as we especially see get into the time of Christ, it becomes like maybe an ego thing. They think they're better than all the other people. And it becomes a cultural thing, even though the intent on all that was spiritual, I believe. But they kind of, in a way, turned it into a cultural thing for them as much as anything. So then come to the time of Christ and the beginning of the church. The early years of the church, who was the Christians? And we read through Acts, who were the Christians? The Jewish people or people that had proselytes like the Ethiopian eunuch. So through the first 8 or 9 chapters, it's only Jews that are becoming Christians. So for the Jews' standpoint, everything's A-okay. We were God's chosen people then. We're Christians now. We've accepted Christ. Everything's cool. We're acting like Jews still. But then when the Gentiles came in, it was almost like when Christ brought the Gentiles in, it was like an atomic bomb in a way, because then there's these people that really maybe never knew the law. They never had this covenant relationship with God, and now they're part of the kingdom. That's got to be, if you're a Jew at the time, that's pretty revolutionary in a way, I think. So they didn't know the law. Moses maybe never heard of it. And from the Jews' standpoint, most importantly, they'd never been in this covenant relationship with God, and they'd never been circumcised. And so this was a huge problem for a lot of the Jews. And so then, I think as Dad kind of indicated a minute ago, this idea that in order for people, the Gentiles, to fully have salvation through Christ, they had to complete their conversion by adopting the Jewish culture, the Jewish customs, and the law. And I think we'll see Paul, three separate issues that he deals with here in the book, that kind of speak to that. The first one is in chapter 2, verse 12, is when it's talking about Peter eating. So the whole separating while eating. So for Jews, why would this have been a problem, you think?
Clean food.
Yeah, I think we've been talking there in our Corinthians class about the whole meat thing, right? And so you got all these food laws, not knowing where food came from, if you're sitting down with a Gentile. So there's that. And then really socially eating with Gentiles wasn't really a cool thing to do, wasn't acceptable. Yes, sir.
But Peter preached that sermon for leaders of his family when he got back to Jerusalem. And the apostles questioned him about what he did. Their specific question was, you ate with Gentiles.
So there's a huge significance to eating, right? Yeah. Another thing that we'll see that there was an issue with, chapter 4, verse 10, is you observe days, months, seasons, and years. It's not said here, but what do we kind of assume that he's talking about? The Jewish feasts, the Jewish holidays. Now, for a Gentile, would the Passover really have any significance to the Gentile? Because what was the Passover feast? It was supposed to remember how God had delivered them from Egyptian bondage, right? Now, obviously, we know today there's much more significance to that. So it would later, as they understood, the Passover would have significance when we consider what God did through Christ on the cross. But the Passover itself, God didn't deliver the Gentiles from the Egyptians. So if it was a feast like that or any of the others, the Feast of Tabernacle was a Feast of Booths where it was supposed to remind them of how they wandered in the wilderness. The Gentiles, again, they didn't wander in the wilderness. So anytime that these people would have tried to force that stuff on them, it wasn't helpful. It had nothing to do with their Christianity. All right, now the third thing is the big issue that we've already touched on it, and that is the whole principle of circumcision. As I said earlier, I think the circumcision, under the law of Moses, was a sign of the covenant relationship with God. And it began with Abraham. And so I guess the big question and the big point of what Paul's whole case that he lays out is what defines who is in a covenant relationship with God? Is it circumcision or being in Christ? And we'll see, and I'm going to go ahead and spoil this. It's being in Christ. It's not circumcision. And we'll see that Paul is adamantly opposed to those insisting that the Gentiles need to accept the law of Moses. And so, again, we look back, to what he says. He refuses to have Titus circumcised. We see how he's opposed to that. Chapter 5, verse 2. If you receive circumcision, Christ is no benefit to you. And then chapter 6, 12 through 15. Those who desire to make a good showing of flesh try to compel you to be circumcised, simply so they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. For those who are circumcised not even keep the law themselves, but they desire to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh. But may it never be that I would boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. Verse 15, neither is circumcision anything, nor uncircumcision. It has nothing to do with circumcision. It's about the cross, is what Paul's point is. It's all about the cross. So that we'll see, and I think he does this in a lot of the epistles. It's almost like, I watch a lot of court TV shows, he's building in a case, just like an attorney would, to build their case in the court. So we'll see how he does that. Real quickly, because we got just a few minutes left. As far as when you think about our just overview here, Galatia, I don't want to shock anybody, but there are debates on what part of Galatia that there is. If you look at Bible scholars or the commentators, which I'm neither one, but is it the southern? Is it the northern? I don't think it's really material to what we're studying. I would, if I'm going to pick one, I would say it's the southern part, because we read in Acts 13 and 14 on his first missionary journey, he goes through the towns of Pisidian, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and that southern region. So I would lean toward that as far as the location. But again, if it's all the above, it still doesn't affect the message that he's writing to them and addressing. Let's see. So I got 5 minutes left. And I was wanting, I may not have time, but one thing I didn't mention is some of the historical details or the events and timeframes that he kind of mentions here in the book. And I guess we'll start out with this on next Sunday. But in chapter 1, verse 18, he talks about a period of 3 years, and then 15 days, and then 14 years. And so trying to figure out when some of this took place, when the book was written, a little bit differently than just the place. This has a little more significance, the time part of it, because he actually spends time talking about it and uses, some of his words to discuss, the different time. And so one thing I'll just kind of mention now is that, I'll ask you this, if you're really wanting to learn about Paul's work, what book of the Bible do we go to? We go to the book of Acts. And I'll ask you this question. Is Acts everything that happened during the early church? No, I kind of got a sarcastic no shake from Eddie because it's so obvious, right? So the book of Acts is only some of the acts of some of the apostles, just like the Gospels is not everything that Jesus did. And so when we go look at and try to figure out maybe some of this stuff in chapter 2, when it talks about the time, we kind of got to keep that in mind that, we're just getting what Luke thought was important for us to read about in the early church and what the work of the apostles. Because I think, for example, Paul mentions Titus going to Jerusalem with him, and Titus, I don't think, is even in the book of Acts. His name never even shows up, I don't think. But Paul mentions it here in this letter. Let's see. So we'll probably start there with that whole. I'll try to wrap that up on Sunday, and then we'll go into chapter 1. Is there any questions or comments on what we've talked about today? Have I missed anything? Okay, so hopefully we'll all survive this together, and we'll do good. So thank you all for your kind attention.